It's my very, very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Isabela Granic. I've known her for a long time, and she's truly distinguished in many ways. I was thinking about how to introduce Isabel, and I harkened back to actually something she forwarded to me several years ago from Tim Urban in Wait But Why. Was trying to figure out what was the secret sauce about visionaries and people who were moving the world, you know, people like Elon Musk and stuff. And it came down to this idea that you wanted to be a chef and not a cook. And to me, Isabel and her work, she's a chef and not a cook. And literally and figuratively, if you have ever had a chance to eat her cooking, it is stupendous. She really is amazing in the kitchen. But is also the kind of person who has reinvented herself career-wise several times as she keeps pursuing her interests. When she started out, she was looking at antisocial behavior, not satisfied with the status quo, went into taking a dynamic systems perspective to understand this. One of her most highly cited papers is with Jerry Patterson, looking at coercion in families as a dynamic systems process. And she took that process orientation and a little bit of dissatisfaction with the status quo to then venture into what you'll hear about today, which is about how we have games played ubiquitously for kids around the world, and yet not really taking advantage of that opportunity for providing the kinds of training, practice that we all need, frankly, for being better regulators of all sorts of emotions and connections to more than just antisocial behavior, but also anxiety and depression. So enough of that. You're going to be very excited about this. I'm really proud to have her up here. Give a round of applause for her. Dr.
Thanks very much. Can everybody hear me? Because I already have a microphone for that one, and I feel kind of weird putting a second one. Just raise your hand if you don't hear me. Nobody has ever said, really? You can't hear me? Okay. All right. All right. Should I put this one on? Because I walk around a lot.
Use the talk show host.
I don't know. All right. So here's what's going to happen, and you're going to get so annoyed by this, you'll tell me to put this down because I do this, okay? Which means that you'll hear the. This one's for that. I'll try. Okay, I can't do it. I can't. Let me just try it. Can I do a double one? Because I won't be able to. I know that my hands.
So clip that.
Double-barreled here.
I'll be impressed if we can get a third one on you.
This is to make you feel like a celebrity.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like twice as awesome now.
Okay. Yes, this works. Yeah. Great. Okay, good?
Good.
All right. Thank you very, very much, Tom, for that ridiculously generous introduction. And I'm really, really happy to be here to talk with you about the work we've been doing for the last, I'd say about 6 years in this area that's relatively new in general. So that's using games, video games, to prevent and treat anxiety and depression in particular. And I'm going to try to take you a little bit through the rationale and journey of why I came to games relatively quickly so that we can get into the meat of what I've got to say. So before I forget, because I almost always run over, and so then I end up having to go way too quickly, none of this that I'm going to show you, and I'm just going to be showing you lots of games and lots of studies, could have been done obviously by myself or 1 or 2 people. This is our lab, the Games for Emotional and Mental Health Lab. At the top are the faculty members who help me supervise the rest of the lab, which are graduate students, all named there, and I thank them very, very much. Also our funders at the ERC and the Dutch Science Foundation, so thank you there. Nothing could have been done without them. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about why we use games and or how we use games, and then I'll take you into a few examples. The first reason that I'm interested in games is they're a great, great intervention tool, and I hope by the end of this talk I'll have convinced you of their promise. They help with motivation, engagement, cost, access, and so on. They're also very, very relevant, nobody's going to have to be convinced of this, to the real world of young people who we're trying to reach. And they also help me in a very deep way learn about mechanisms that then feed back to theory development. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as well. We use games for theory development and refinement and testing. So one of the beautiful things about games is that they are intrinsically modular, and you can take parts of those games out or put them in and use them as experimental designs. And I'll show you how we do that. We can also use them for randomized controlled trials with mediating and moderating kinds of designs. And we can also use these games as simulation and computational modeling tools. I'm not going to have time to show you some of the work that we're doing on that, but they're just these fantastic tools to do computational modeling with. And finally, I want to end today talking to you about this last kind of funky reason we want to use games, and that is to inform future design of developmentally healthy interactive spaces for young people. And what I mean by that is, whether we like it or not, I'm going to try to convince you in the last 10 to 15 minutes that the world is going to change vastly very quickly in the next 5 to 10 years. And these, gadgets that we are so worried about, our kids being too much on, I don't know where my gadget is, here, my gadget, and their faces being on there, will no longer exist as an interface between us and the digital world. And the implications for that are huge. And I'm a developmental psychologist by training and at heart, and I would like to be able to inform the design of these kinds of boundaries to the extent that I can, so that kids like this, these are my two 12-year-olds who were forced to come here because my husband is out of town, those spaces become healthy, social, productive, interesting spaces for them. Okay. Hopefully I don't have to go into this very much with this crowd. I'm particularly interested in anxiety and depression and games for anxiety and depression prevention and treatment, because approximately 1 out of every 4 young person is going to be diagnosed with a problem by the time they reach 18. Okay, 1 in 4. That means either you yourself are struggling with these problems of anxiety and depression, or somebody very close to you is. It's hugely relevant to a whole host of not only mental health problems, but also physical problems that are comorbid. So we really want to have an impact on the most prevalent mental health problem there is out there. And that's where we start. We move to the fact that a whole lot of people, not just me, have thought about digital solutions as one way to address the problem of having such a huge proportion of people needing help. And so few, relatively speaking, professionals that can deal with that demand. So many people have turned to the idea and the promise of e-mental health, or digital mental health solutions. And I'm going to summarize this vast, huge, 10-year at least literature, and say that for adults, e-mental health solutions generally work, small to moderate effect sizes, but pretty good. But they work way better if there is a adult, or not an adult, sorry, a clinician or a coach helping people through those e-mental health solutions for adults. For youth, they suck. That's my deep statistical summary for you. There are small to no effects, especially when you compare e-mental health solutions to active controls. And there's a bunch of reviews and meta-analyses. I'll make my slides available to anybody who wants them, that can look it up, that have come to these conclusions, okay? We're not the only ones, but we did write and recently got it's going to be out probably in a week, because these papers, open source papers, are out really fast. We did write a review of all of that e-mental health data, and All of these meta-analyses end with the exact same conclusion for young people. We need to figure out how to be more engaging, how these e-mental health solutions can be more motivating for young people, because they're not working, because guess what? Young people go to these computers or their phones and they have cognitive behavioral therapy, exercises and so on, and they're bored out of their minds after the first 5 to 10 minutes. They never go back, they never do their homework, they're completely disengaged. And so all meta-analyses end that way, and they say, don't know what the solution is. And so what we do in this paper is try to outline a framework that comes from design principles. Has anybody ever heard of design thinking? The terrible misnomer. Okay, so 3 of you. It's an entire discipline out there of design that uses this framework, which is actually poorly written down, because designers like to do stuff and try stuff out and see what's wrong with that doing and those attempts, and then iterate on those attempts and try to make better products out of that. Everything we do right now, everything we're enjoying on our phones, is based on a lot of input from this design thinking process. And so our solution to this problem, or a proposed solution to the problem of disengagement in e-mental health, is to look to design to try to figure out how to create these products that are more delightful, delighting, inviting for young people while they learn. But guess what? We already have a wonderful tool or mechanism or context that is delighting our young people, and that is video games. As you know, 97% of young people play video games. I'm not talking only console, I'm talking Candy Crush on your phone, or Mad Birds, not Bad Birds, Angry Birds, and so on, right? So how many of you play video games? Just show of hands. Okay, for those of you who still have their hands down, you're telling me you don't have Scrabble or Wordplay or any of that on your phone and you never pick it up, right? Yeah, so then there's a few more hands, and I'll pretty much get 100% of you or 98% of you putting your hands up. And the reason is really clear. Video games are intrinsically engaging. People spend lots and lots of money and resources to make them so. There is no problem with retaining attention in video games. So there's a very easy retention problem being solved there. There's very little cognitive, or the cognitive load, and this is a problem with e-mental health solutions. E-mental health often stresses young people out in terms of the cognitive load. It's either too much or too little. It's not a good match for the people who are working in there. Video games are these wonderfully dynamically adjusted systems that change as the player gets better and better as they play, right? So the cognitive load is always dynamically balanced. There's very little stigma to playing video games unless you're a 60-year-old who's looking down at young kids. And as I said, the dynamic nature of these video games allows us to personalize the experience of these video games for any of the players that start up. So they can be either made more difficult or less difficult. They can be made to match people's desire to have narrative or puzzle, different genres and so on. So the personalization is a really, really lovely benefit of video games that is not one that we have with something like therapy, which we usually use a one-size-fits-all kind of solution, and we send it out to the world either in schools or in clinics. So at our lab, which is the Games for Emotional and Mental Health Lab, or the GEM Lab, we've got a mission that goes something like this, or at least it's an applied mission, which is to transform how mental health interventions are designed, delivered, and experienced. And each of these words means something very specific to us. In terms of design, all of our design is a multidisciplinary process. We have game designers, engineers, machine learning people working alongside scientists, clinicians, developmental psychologists, and so on. So it truly is multidisciplinary, not that a social psychologist is working with a clinical psychologist, but it's artists and designers working with psychologists and scientists. We try to balance the science and the principle, so you'll see that there's this kind of groundwork of scientific principles and practice that we always start from, okay? And we pull the clinical practices that we know have a good solid evidence base out there into all of the games that we design. However, we try to then balance the amount of time and effort and resources we put to the art as well, because that's what we know is what is going to pull people in and keep people's attention in these games. We do a process of evidence-based iterative testing, and we make sure that youth are at the table almost from the beginning in terms of telling us what they like, what they don't like, why they would want to play a video game for depression or for anxiety and so on. So we're always iterating on the prototypes with young people themselves. So that's the design of the games. In terms of the delivery model, what we're used to in clinical psychology and also even prevention programs in schools is this very much this paternalistic kind of pushing onto kids programs that we say, this is good for you, okay, just trust us. And what we would prefer is that a more of a pull, I haven't figured out a better way of saying this, more of a pull model of delivery. We want kids to actually be motivated to take these video games off the shelf themselves or download them off themselves, whatever they're doing with things. We want them to have autonomy and choice when they pick these games, so that there's lots of people who say, yeah, but you're never going to be able to like compete with Halo or whatever it is. I disagree. I think it's not that we want to compete with Halo, but just like the film industry, where there are lots and lots of different films and documentaries have a place and an audience, and people who go to Hollywood movies also go to documentaries. This is how I think about the games we're going to be designing. If they are entertaining enough, delightful enough, interesting enough to raise the curiosity of kids, they'll play those games. They'll also play Halo, but they'll play our games as well. We want these games to be commercial and accessible. I've got a whole talk about how to do that and why there's huge, huge barriers for us to get the evidence-based games out there to the actual people who need them. But I won't go on and rant about that right now. And we want also a platform where kids can share on social networks and so on our games. Then in terms of the experience, we want these games to feel relevant to kids. We want kids to feel respected when they're playing it, that they don't feel talked down to feel empowered, inspired, and that most of these games eventually we want to be also social in nature. Okay, and I hope to show you a little bit of all of these. The very basic approach that we take is that we take these scientific practices, evidence-based practices, things like cognitive restructuring, exposure therapy, etc. We take what we know works in a clinic context, and we then translate those techniques into game mechanics, okay? Mechanics, when I say mechanics, what I mean is these are the verbs of the game. So approaching things that are scary and having to approach repeatedly as a mechanic, and so on. And then what we're hoping for is with repeated practice and exposure to the game over and over again, that there are changes in thought patterns, emotional patterns, and so on, which then translate to changes in anxiety and depression, and we have a happy, healthy population of people out there. Okay, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about a game that we designed called Mindlight first, and also several other games to give you an example of this approach and how it works. Importantly, I've already told you this, that we have a whole lot of people working on the research as well as the design of the games, and that means that we bring a whole bunch of stakeholders, but also clinicians, scientists, academics who work with the commercial game developers themselves. We then do research on these games and the different components of it, and we feed back that research to the game designers so that they can iteratively improve those games, and then ultimately what we'd like to do is be able to get into the commercial market as well as to mental health institutions and schools. This is just a picture that I don't want you to look at carefully, but only to say that this is a very long process usually. And it is an iterative one that this is just the first year of design and development, and each of these lines represents another discipline that's involved in it. You don't have to look at it closely. My only point is that there's a lot of people coordinating their efforts at each point before we even get to the science part, which is study one. Oh, sorry. The design collaborators, I just want to give you a bit of a sense of this. These are partnerships that have been building over the years, and so we work with people at University of Southern California, for example, the game design department, people like commercial game designers like Robin Hunneke from that game company, as well as Aardman Animation and others. So the work that I'm going to show you is really the art and design is really about co-creation with these folks and partners. And again, just one more sort of larger picture before I get into the specifics. Scientifically or theoretically, what we start off with is a set of theories, large-scale theories. The ones that we are most fond of at this point are social baseline or tend and befriend models, cognitive behavioral theory, and biopsychosocial stress models. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of those, but each of those have concomitant mechanisms that are most important in terms of how they have an impact on depression and anxiety. So things like growth versus fixed mindset, reappraisal, attention bias modification, all have to do with cognitive behavioral theories or principles. And these are what we try to tap in our games and change over the course of play, all right? In terms of social baseline, these are examples. If you're not familiar, it doesn't matter. But the idea is that we have these theories that implicate certain mechanisms of change in depression and anxiety that we then target through game mechanics, and then we have a set of games that we design out of that, okay? And that's the general idea. All of these games and mechanisms are then constrained by and influenced by things like mindset, expectations, motivation. These are in the clinical world called non-specific factors, and they work just as much, if not more, in the game world as well. If you're not motivated to change, none of our games are going to do anything. If you don't have the expectation that video games can have a positive impact on you, or your child, for example, that's going to have an impact on outcomes. So we do research on all of those kinds of constraining factors as well. That's important. So now I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. And I'll start with Mindlight, which is a neurofeedback 3D video game that was designed to prevent and treat anxiety in young kids, so not so young, 8 to 12-year-olds. And it's a neurofeedback game in that you wear this goofy headset, which is a one-channel EEG headset, measuring alpha, beta, theta waves. I can get into that later. But that is the direct input into the game. As kids get less anxious, the light in the game grows. As kids get scared, it gets darker. So you're playing the game, and in real time, your little headset is making more or less light. And the idea is that the game becomes increasingly more scary, and as it gets more scary, you have to continue to use your relaxation techniques that you're taught within the context of the game. So I can talk about this game, or I can just show you an example. The two main mechanisms of change are exposure therapy that we use, so exposing yourself to scary things, using relaxation at the same time. We know this works in clinical context. And the second is attention bias modification, which after 6 months of having finished the game, there was a meta-analysis showing that it does not work at all for children. Not helpful, but anyway, after the fact, but we have some evidence to suggest that that is true even in our game. But these were the two main parts of the game that we put into in terms of science. And so what all our games, in all our games, what we could do is go through this process that starts from, in early phase development, this is time. This is the type of study with big N studies versus short-term, low-end studies. Okay, this is just a conceptual kind of picture to give you a sense of the process. And we start by pilot testing and user testing in terms of the intervention development, but we do a bunch of paper prototyping in terms of the game itself. And we always separate the testing of our intervention goals versus the test of the game goals. Game goals are things like engagement, fun, delight, learning how to play the little doodad or whatever it is. The intervention development, on the other hand, are things like, are they feeling anxious? We need them to feel anxious if we're going to do exposure therapy. Are they, is there too much of a cognitive load? Is there reactance? And so on. So at each one of these phases, we have psychological or intervention goals that we test, and also game development goals. And so right now, in terms of, we did a whole bunch of paper prototyping on Mindlight and so on, and then we had what we call alpha test, a game. And sorry, and I just wanted to give you an example of one of the paper prototyping before any code is even done. Okay, what we do is do a bunch of paper prototyping. I don't know if they still remember, but at 8 years old, okay. So at 8 years old, we went into their daycare-ish kind of thing, and there was about 30 kids. And we had to ask, what are the scariest monsters that we can put in here, and yet ones that won't turn them off? And we thought the scariest, you can't see that great, but anyway, we thought the scariest ones would be these like one-eyed goof, like totally unreal, weird-looking things, right? The adults, the game designers, like, yep, one-eyed. We got to put the one-eyed ones. We put it in front of all the kids, and absolutely unanimously, they were like, the creepy ones are the two-eyed little slit guys, okay? Who knew, okay? But that kind of prototyping, that bottom line, very basic kind of thing, was the kind of thing we had to do over and over for all sorts of levels of the game to make sure that it was balanced in terms of how scary it was, but still approachable, right? So this was just to give you an example of the kind of prototyping that we do early on. And then we do a bunch of user testing, which is the fun part, of course. That kid is a 5-year-old kid holding up the VR thing and using Deep, which I'll show you a little bit later on. And this is, of course, Mindlight and me with lots of kids prototyping. Okay, and so we test, again, two things. For emotional design and engagement on the game side, and then the intervention side. So let me just show you the game so that you have a sense of what it looks like. So they start off without a little thing on their head. They put on the headset themselves, which is super easy to put on. And then they're given all these tasks to go up to scary objects and decloak them by staying with their light, by staying calm. The more relaxed you are, the bigger the light. They practice in this practice room first, and then there's these two-eyed cats that come out. This is the attention bias modification puzzle, one of them. They have to look for the neutral face and ignore the scary face. And they learn to approach scary things instead of avoiding them, to use safety behaviors less and less over the course of the game. And of course, they get rewarded by coins and things like that, but generally, the fact that you can change something in a game with your mind is pretty rewarding as well. Okay. All right. So you get the idea. And so they can play, there's about 6 to 8 hours of gameplay depending on who you are, what kid you are, and how good you are. And now what I want to do is just skip over a lot of the mechanic experiments that we did because we had to figure out which ones were working and which ones weren't. And just skip to the randomized controlled trial and efficacy trials. So here we go. So we've run now 4 randomized controlled trials, one of which was run by Tom here at Queen's. And all 4 of them has shown similar results. I want to show you this last one, which is a randomized controlled trial with 8 to 12-year-olds who, selected for being high in anxiety. And they were either assigned to cognitive behavioral therapy in groups in schools, or they were assigned to Mindlight to play 7 times basically weekly, okay? So there were about 1,200 kids who were screened for this trial. 174 were selected for it and then randomly assigned. And what I'm going to show you right now is self-reported child anxiety, but there was also parent-reported anxiety, parent-reported children's anxiety that showed the exact same results. I'll show you pre-test, which is before they started playing or went into cognitive behavioral therapy. Post-test is after the 2 months or 2.5 months. 3-month follow-up, so they've stopped therapy, though they've stopped the game, they have no access to the game anymore, and 6-month follow-up, no access to the game or therapy anymore, okay? And here's the beautiful results. Sorry, I should say this was registered as a non-inferiority trial. So CBT, we know, works for anxiety, especially in selected prevention programs. If we didn't get that result, we wouldn't be doing a good job, all right? So all we wanted to show was that we were as good as face-to-face cognitive behavioral therapy. And what you see is this beautiful slope of decreasing anxiety by about half by 3-month follow-up. And these gains end up remaining at 6-month follow-up as well. And so this has also been replicated now in 2 other studies. One of them is a clinical study with autistic kids. And in that study, the autistic kids in MindLight group became less, we're not treating autism, we're decreasing autistic kids' anxiety levels. And in that one, MindLight did even better than CBT, probably because there wasn't such a cognitive load and there didn't have to be this abstract thinking skills and so on that kids with autism had to work through. Anyway, so we are super, super encouraged by these kinds of results. And if you asked kids, whether they like to play the video game, this was the easiest study I've ever had to recruit kids into our study. It was also the easiest to get schools because, they're like, sure, these kids are going to come out, but they're playing a video game. We don't have to shove them out. There's no stigma. These kids actually were the ones that were being envied by the other kids because they got to get out of the classroom and play a video game. And in the autism study, what was also really interesting is the parents were so relieved. So their stress levels went down because, first of all, they're generally feeling pretty guilty about how much video games these kids are playing. And so now they had this context where they could be happy that their kids are actually benefiting. And secondly, that their kids weren't screaming about going into the clinic, right? So this was a really big deal. Just to also say that if you look at meta-analyses on selected prevention programs, so Kendall's meta-analyses, the effect size for MindLight is approximately equal to what you see in CBT programs in general, so not just in our study, which is a really nice thing to see. Okay, we then also look at, as I said, we try to dismantle, this isn't a pure dismantling study, but we try to look at the mechanisms of change. So were the things that we designed in the game actually the action mechanisms that improved anxiety in these kids? And so there were several candidates, and we looked at 3-month follow-up only for this. So in the game, you have these chests that you can hide in. In clinical psychology, these are called safety behaviors. You hide away from the dangerous things. There's a problem with that, though, because you're not learning to face your fears. What we would have expected, or what we wanted, is for kids to become less reliant on these safety behaviors over time if their anxiety was improving. So that's one mechanism we looked at. We looked at the amount of time they spent in full MindLight, in other words, a pure relaxed state. And we also looked at exploration. We wanted exploration to increase over time as anxiety decreased. And we designed for that in the game. And that's exactly what we found. So decreases in duration in chest from pre to post. We're predicting 3-month follow-up anxiety levels. So people who spent less and less time in the chest were the ones that were getting better through playing game. Increases in the duration of the bright MindLight also predicted 3-month follow-up, and increases in exploration also predicted 3-month follow-up. So this is really encouraging because we can say these design elements seem to be part of what is influencing these outcomes. Attention bias modification puzzles, no relation to outcomes, which wasn't surprising after the meta-analysis, but it was actually interesting to see that it had absolutely the number of puzzles you solved, the amount of time you spent on attention bias, none of it predicted outcomes. Okay, so we have a sense also about knowing the mechanisms, and eventually what we'd like to do is be able to actually inform clinical theory and practice by talking about certain controversies in the field. And I don't want to get too much into the details, but by doing dismantling studies, we can also be able to inform further treatment development even outside of the context of games. Okay, now I want to tell you about another game called Deep with a similar background. These are our goofy people. I just love it because, so we go on these yoga retreats with like, I never do this with scientists, but if you've got game designers, right, we go on yoga retreats and we design Deep and we're like inspired by all this, beautiful meditative thing because that's what Deep is. So this is the group. And let me just show you a little bit while I talk about what Deep is, and you can just relax. Doesn't that feel chill? Okay, so Deep is a underwater virtual reality game. And you wear a belt around your diaphragm. On purpose, you do not wear it around your chest or anywhere else. And when you breathe in, it's controlled by breathing. The deeper your breath is, the bigger that circle becomes. And what it does is it basically incentivizes deep diaphragmatic breathing. If you're around anxious kids and you try to teach them how to do that deep diaphragmatic breathing, it's very, very difficult. It's actually really, really hard to teach this to adults as well. And the entire way that you move through this atmosphere and swim is through breathing. If you breathe shallow or just through your chest, you sink to the bottom and you can't move. So you have to start taking deep breaths and you go up and down in this little world. It's actually not so little anymore. And it's this beautiful landscape. And this is what it looked like when I first approached the designers and said, dude, I want to work with you. Okay, we can even put in, okay, you've got the deep diaphragmatic breathing. I want to add more evidence-based practices in this game and see if we can even improve outcomes, okay? There's these little dudes. We now have them where, so cool. The kids can now follow these big whales, because if they don't know how to do the breathing, they can just try to hang on to the whale, and the only way to do that is by changing their breathing patterns, and so on. These are the two designers, Owen Harris and Nikki Smith, fantastic designers and artists. So one of the evidence-based mechanisms that we put in there, evidence-based is such a big word for the fact that we just put in more feedback, okay? So interoceptive awareness is really hard to keep remembering how you feel and to tune into that. And one way to do that is to provide more contingent feedback. And so what we did was we changed it so that not only the circle goes there, but now everything around you changes with your breathing. So it gets brighter and darker as you breathe in and out to increase the interoceptive awareness. And then we tested whether interoceptive awareness increases with players, which indeed it does when we added this element. We also looked at individual differences. So we had 76 kids who went through this pilot or prototyping phase where we asked them to go through the game on their own. And what we found, not surprisingly, was a whole bunch of individual differences in how people were able to learn, the learning rate of this kind of breathing, right? And what we wanted, so what you see there on the top is one 11-year-old kid who kind of doesn't really get it. He gets a few of these deep breaths, so the longer the line, the more inhalation, the deeper the inhalation. And what you see is he kind of doesn't get it. He's constantly kind of coming back to that shallow breathing. Here's someone who totally gets it. So first, doesn't get it, shallow breathing, very little of that, and then suddenly starts getting this real rhythmic, very deep breathing. Others that have these kind of stuck on the floor in different times. And what we want to do, and what we are doing right now, is building these algorithms based on machine learning paradigms so that we can identify predictors. So before this deep breathing happens, what are the kinds of signals that we can identify across individuals that we know are going to predict that they're learning? And so if we know that they're hitting that predictor, we want to make the environment as consistent to continuing to learn that. But if they're in these kind of places where they're not learning, we want to be able to adjust the environment so that it scaffolds their learning in a more effective way, okay? This is so super fun because individual differences, you get tons of individual differences, and when you can start using these kinds of algorithms and they actually tune the environment around you, people feel like you're really adjusted, and they're completely, the entrainment of their body and their breathing into their environment is really powerful for people. So people will take these things off and start like crying, and they don't know why. And it's just because they've been able to downregulate so efficiently. So right now, this study that I don't have, unfortunately, I'm literally 2 weeks away from the data, but we don't have yet the data, is this large-scale exposure therapy study where we take, I don't remember, 200 or so young people, 15 to 25, with elevated anxiety symptoms, and they're randomly assigned to one of 4 training sessions with either deep or a commercially available breathing app kind of thing. And then we look at anxiety symptoms, but we also look at changes in physiology, gameplay experience, their appraisals of how well they can do on their own, and so on. And just to give you an idea of how these look, you saw how relaxing the other one was. This is the exposure element. So they go into this relaxing atmosphere, and then at some point it becomes much more stressful. Except that you can't hear anything. That's weird. Okay, usually it's really scary sounding, but this is not scary sounding. Anyway, it usually is like dun 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 dun, which is really, really scary, and I'm perfectly, and it gets very, very dark. So again, what we want to look at is not only how do they adjust to that environment, but whether they can regulate through it, so and learn from that experience and recover. And I think one of the reasons why virtual reality, apart from lots of other technical reasons, that VR hasn't taken off is, so sorry, let's finish with that. We're really encouraged by what we are finding in DEEP and what we think we're going to find in terms of its effect on anxiety symptoms. But both of those studies that I just showed you are about the individual. They're still about one person going into this world of a video game on their own. And where I think the most important advances are going to come in terms of impact on changes in depression and anxiety is going to be the social world. So now everything we're doing from now on has a social element. Not only because more than 75% of what the games that kids are playing are social in nature somehow, but also because we know anxiety and depression, in particular depression, has a huge social element, right, that we want to have an impact on. So with DEEP, we're going to end up having two people be able to go in there and regulate one another. With MindLight, we'll be able to have parents and children interacting with one another and helping each other co-regulate, because also we have a lot of anxious parents along with the kids and so on. In the interest of time, I will not go into the entire developmental literature on infancy and social interactions, but just to say we are social creatures evolved to be such, and so that is a really important element of what where we want to go next. And we take a lot of inspiration from social baseline theory. We know that our threat response is much more acute when we are alone, and our baseline is much more calm when we're close to people that we care about and can trust, okay? Being alone basically is stressful. So towards this end, what we're going to do is, sorry, try to ignore this for a second. What we're going to do is design games that help depressed individuals become more socially skilled in different types of contexts, right? And we want to teach them these skills through online games that mean something to them, okay? And so what we've done as a first step is to design a game that can first and foremost assess rejection sensitivity, which is one of the main predictors of depression in young people. So towards that end, how many of you know Cyberball? Many of you. Okay, good. So it looks something like this, or it looks even more boring. I'm sorry for Cyberball people, but it can look black and white. So Cyberball is a game that's been used for 20 plus years, game, paradigm, whatever. And the idea is that you play along with these 2 or 3 other players who are actually not real players. The ball is being tossed to you, and at one point the ball stops being tossed to you. You feel left out, isolated, rejected, and so on, okay? 20 years this has been used in fMRI studies and so on. There's a few problems with this. You can't repeat this thing because it's boring as all hell, which is crucial for developmental research. You have to be able to repeat assessments. It's not really, doesn't really feel like an authentic social experience after the first 5 minutes or so, or 2 minutes or so. Most people aren't really hugely emotionally engaged. Yes, you can get some some results from it, but still, most people who have tried it will say that it's not a hugely engaging emotional experience. It's too short or it's too boring, because if you put it any longer. So there's all sorts of things that you can't measure around that. And probably the most important thing for me is that there's a passive assessment in Cyberball. You're just being isolated or rejected, and then you can't do anything about it, which is very much unlike what our lives are like. When we are rejected, we can walk away, we can aggress, we can try to engage in some way, etc. So one of the things that we really care about in terms of depression is what are the responses to rejection that depressed people have, and can we shift those to more resilient responses, okay? So first we have to design something that is actually able to assess rejection sensitivity. So with this next study that I'm going to show you, we wanted to deal with all these limitations of Cyberball, build a reliable paradigm that triggers feelings of rejection and provides opportunities to react. And this is a first step towards an intervention. Again, lots of prototyping. Here is the very ugly first draft of this, okay? It's horribly ugly. But if you ask these two, it's super fun, okay? You agree, thank you. What happens in this game? It's ridiculous, right? It's ugly, it's totally ugly. It's not about just prettiness when we design well. It has to be engaging. So what happens is that basically you as the player there are completely ignored by everybody else who's playing, okay? In this first phase. So nobody is cooperating with you and you're just kind of left out. That's the first phase of that. There's not much reaction that you can do. In the second phase of the game, everybody can trade jewels and money, and I don't remember what else you can trade, right? And nobody trades with you or gives you stuff. And you are, again, not only left out, but actually actively you get less resources. So it's a form of active rejection, okay? Again, really, really ugly. Just don't look at it. It's just ugly, all right? And then for the third phase, everybody has to vote who gets to go through the gate, and guess what? You're voted out, okay? So that's the third phase. And so there's these different forms of rejection that you can have, and there are different ways of responding. You can text, you can do all sorts of things. Oh my God, it's going to go on and on. Okay, so in this study, we had 116 participants, young adults. They played either Cyberball or Scroll Quest. Again, we're trying to make something that it provides active opportunities to react, but first and foremost, we want to say that we have a paradigm that works as well or better than Cyberball. Three other players the three other players in the game are controlled by a Confederate who does the rejection that you just saw. And that's what you really need to know. The first thing we asked is, after they played the game, participants, how much did you like playing the game? And not a huge surprise. Participants liked Scroll Quest is the horrible name of our game. So participants liked Scroll Quest significantly more than Cyberball. This is not a huge surprise given that if you've ever looked at Cyberball. So that was encouraging, right? They want to play it. But the most important things that we were looking for were the mood changes, okay? And so we used exactly the measures that people use for Cyberball in this study. And what you saw is in terms of pre, post, after playing. I know, it's terrible. How happy are you? Before, they were perfectly happy. Then they played Cyberball, and indeed, they got a little less happy. But with Scroll Quest, they were pissed off. Arousal levels, significant difference. So everything here is significantly different. So both groups change in the right direction, but what you get consistently is that Scroll Quest is getting more acute, more dramatic changes in mood across things like feelings of control, arousal, and happiness. I've got lots of other results that basically match everything that Cyberball has done, all in a stronger direction is significant. I'm not going to put them all in there, but I just wanted to give you a sense of it. Much more importantly to me is to be able to also assess the emotional experiences of these kids. Okay, these are the kids. I asked them for active consent every single time. You're right, I only asked Julian because you're perfectly fine. Anyway, so I've asked them again for consent. What I wanted point out, and I think this is really important because we have all of these participants. One of the other cool things about video games is you have the faces of all of our participants. So perfect video taped emotional responses to all these things, right? And what we wanted to do is say, are we getting authentic experiences? We took a year and a half to make that ugly game because in all cases, people didn't take it personally. People didn't take the rejection or the being isolated. It's just a game, right? So it's super hard to make something that they start feeling like it's about them and they want to regulate. And that's what we want to see, because then when we start training their emotional responses to be more resilient, we need them to feel those authentic experiences. So this is, I'm going to just show you the torture that I put my poor child through. What the hell? Just look.
You're dead again.
That's my really empathic child. Look at his face.
Really? Why can't I get on level 5 and I have 15 lives and that's the most? The third time?
Yeah. He recovered very well, but you can see there's regulation there, right? He said it was perfectly fine. He recovered immediately, etc. He was paid with lots of candy, etc. A little bit. Okay, the important thing here is that we got authentic emotional experiences. These guys play lots of video games. There's all sorts of rejection in these video games. It's really important to make sure that these things matter to them, the games that we design matter to them, because otherwise the learning that they do in these contexts is not authentic either and won't generalize to their everyday lives. So that's really important. And so what we're doing now is doing real-time affective coding of these rejection episodes to see how people recover as well. The game is now being coded to look way, way better, and the most important part of this is that we want to be able to also see the real-time responses in the game. So do people aggress back? Do they withdraw? Do they negotiate, and so on? We want to measure the stickiness of these responses. So how flexible are their responses when they're reacting to rejection? And can we build an intervention context around the game that then helps them become more resilient to the rejection that they will inevitably face over and over in their lives? Okay, so this is what the new version or something like it is going to be, is starting to look like. And we are on our website, and I'll give you the address at the end. We're going to have people be able to download it for free, because the idea is to have it open access so that coders can go and tweak with whatever the behaviors are and the kinds of rejection or not rejection or cooperative behaviors, so that they can then do their own studies on different facets of rejection and recovery and so on. I think I just told you that. Oh, and so now what we're doing in the second phase of this doctoral dissertation is going to be to build the intervention around that. So have opportunities to recover from the rejection and to go back to people and ask for help in ways that end up being successful and so on. Okay, and in the last 10 minutes that I have, I want to address so obviously I'm very positive about the potential for these games as intervention tools, as prevention tools, as promotion for emotional resilience training tools, and so on. But what's really important that people will inevitably ask is, yeah, but what about the addiction to screens? And what about the fact that technology is making all these kids antisocial and they have absolutely no skills to begin with now, and nobody can have conversations anymore or look people in the eyes, and they're all texting and, you know, so on. And I want to first make the point that this has been said since forever, okay? Radio was also going to ruin all of us, and TV was as well. And you know, you see this all over the media about our youth becoming more and more antisocial, becoming addicted to our screens and so on. And I want to suggest that this is just part of the growing pains of going into a very, very new digital age. And it's inevitable, and that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have, you know, some time to go outside and climb trees and so on, and some some common sense around that. But also, I'm afraid as a developmental psychologist that if I spend the next 10 years trying to solve the problem of kids facing their phones, that I'm solving a problem that isn't going to be around after. And that is because, is it Moore? Is it Moore's law? It's Moore's law, right? Who's the one that technology is getting? So the rate of change of technology, I think it's Moore's law. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. Nobody. All right, thanks. Anyway, the rate of technology and processing speed and so on is exponentially increasing to the degree that anybody who knows anything about this, if you read, solid scientists in technology fields and media fields, they're all predicting that this thing is going to be gone as an interface. And as a result, the problems of this idea that they're stuck in their screens is not going to be the problem that we're going to most be interested in solving. And I want to add that the problem of kids being antisocial on these things is also, I think, very ill-defined, because in the vast majority of cases, our phones, our devices, are not actually devices for being antisocial on. And there's lots of really good evidence emerging that this is the case, that the same kind of social needs that our playgrounds served are being nicely served in these contexts. So this is, again, Julian, because I have consent from him, right? I don't have to keep doing this with all the kids in our studies. I don't have to keep getting consent from other parents. So this is one of my gamer dudes. And this is Julian looking like the typical couch potato, video game addict, playing something that's pretty intense in terms of fighting and all of that. And you think, okay, this is exactly what we're worried about. Kids being on their own, on the couch, doing nothing, right? But what I want to point out to is a couple of things. Next to him is his phone on, and the entire time he's conversing with his friend. And his friend is not even conversing about the game. He's talking about what girl they like that day, their worries about tests. They're doing what a lot of kids do in playgrounds, in that they talk in this parallel way while they're playing. And it is, I'm amazed. I could have videotaped it, but then it would have been really embarrassing. But it's this kind of thing, right? And at the same time, what they're doing is also having tons of interactions in the game. Most of the games they're playing are multiplayer games, and they're coordinating goals, they're coordinating roles, they're taking leadership roles, etc. There's a huge social context that's going on when kids are playing games. And I think that's really important to think about how they navigate that, but also when those screens are going away, what that's going to mean in terms of us informing the design of these spaces. Because the future is entirely interaction. We are not going to have these bricks on our heads when we play VR. That's just the interim right now, okay? What we are going to have is things like contact lenses or glasses that we can see one another, that we can have a conversation with one another sitting in the same place, and we can create worlds between us that are both virtual and hard real, whatever that means. Don't get me into the matrix and the reality thing and all that. But I'm very serious in that there is going to, I think that the next generation of infants right now are going to grow up in a space at this boundary of real and digital, where they will be able to be co-creating things and bringing them up in contexts that we can't really think about very well. But the technology right now is just at the boundaries right now. So it'll look more like this. They will be co-creating experiences and play contexts and so on, and learning in these contexts. And then when people are in this AR, VR, mixed reality world, and they can co-create worlds together that weren't designed for them originally, that's where things are going to get freaky and are going to get really, really interesting, okay? Because this entrainment with the virtual world, we're not going to talk about real versus online versus offline. There's going to be this kind of seamless way of going into these affordances back and forth. And that's what I want as a developmental psychologist to start thinking about very hard, because that's the so this is what they often talk about as AR, right? Where this is already there. Pokemon Go gives you a device that you put in front of you, right? But when the device is gone and it's just on your head, and so you're not actually using your hands for it, it's going to become a much more different, interesting way to interact with one another. So I have this example that I think about often when when our kids that are 8 years old have to walk to school for the first time alone. And what would happen if at that time they were able to conjure their imaginary friend that's not so imaginary, that also sleeps with them, to walk with them to school? What kind of resilience or what kinds of things could they be building for themselves to make them feel stronger, more, less alone, all sorts of things. And of course I can go the evil way. I can completely imagine how this can go terribly, terribly wrong. But what I would invite all of us to think about is how can we think about ways to help talk to technologists and media experts around what's going to be very important around social interaction, especially with young people as they grow up, and inform that discussion instead of just money informing that discussion, which is another rant I won't go into. And so I'm going to end with the kind of impact that we want to measure. So we've got our publications, and I can continue to go on with video games and design them and do randomized controlled trials and get into pretty good journals now. And that's really important, but I think what's much more important now is to have an impact on the next generation. I don't think psychologists have talked enough to media experts right now at the edge of creating these technologies that are having huge impacts on our kids. And I think we have to be much more involved in that and have an impact on that. And one of the ways that we're doing it in our lab is to take the research from our lab and start disseminating the validated mechanics to designers, to scientists, and so on, so that they can go on to build games and products and so on that are delighting kids and engaging them, but also may actually also have a really positive impact on their mental health. So commercialization, I think, is a really essential, very thorny problem, but I think if we don't do it, then our mind lights and our deeps are going to stay in the ivory tower, and the kids and families and so on are not going to have get the benefits they want. And that's a whole other discussion that I think is really important to have, but maybe over a glass of wine after the reception. So thank you very much, and please visit our website if you want to get to know a little bit more about the other projects. Thanks. Exactly on time. Questions? Yeah.
Yes, outside of North America, there's millions of kids that have been more traumatized with loud explosions, dismembered bodies. Have you tried any of these methods with non-suburban kids in severe trauma?
Yeah, so it's a really, really great question. We've worked with members of the WHO and UNICEF, and we're right now still working with them to get, so what's shocking to most people is that many under-resourced places around the world, even though they don't have a whole lot of money and resources, what they do have is at least one cell phone per family at least, and almost ubiquitous Wi-Fi or cell reception. And so we are absolutely interested in those kinds of vulnerable populations that have been either traumatized through war, or displacement, or refugees, and so on. And so what we're doing is trying to work with folks who come from the education sphere, because mental health is still so stigmatized in those communities that it's a lot, at least for us, we found it might be easier to go through the education sphere. So there are people who are working with games around executive functioning and other kinds of language learning and so on, and then we're putting in a couple of modules that are like relaxation modules and reappraisal sort of exercises through games that we hope will have some kind of impact. But I think you're absolutely right, it's hugely important. And there's this great scaling potential, so why don't we do it? Yeah, I think it's really important, yeah.
So I'm curious about the commercialization piece, because I recently saw the Mr. Rogers documentary, and so what you're doing reminds me of, like, Mr. Rogers saw TV and he thought there's such potential to help kids, and he made this great show, and I think your work is very similar to that. I'm also very cynical about Silicon Valley and their priorities, and as much as they have the narrative of changing the world, I can see them taking this VR technology to, for what's been done.
Oh, they're monsters, absolutely.
Right. So do you see this as something that, like the pull model, do you see this as something that kids are going to voluntarily purchase, or do you see it as being incorporated in school systems and is sort of, like they're introduced to it, but more through authority figures as opposed to their own free time?
Yes. is my answer.
Okay.
Both.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think if we're doing our job right, we have another game that we first started with the prevention of, to help young people stop smoking, okay? And the game is this competitive runner game that they play in teams of other people trying to stop smoking. And they've publicly committed to it, and they find it super fun because it's a runner game, why not? And they play it instead of the smoke at that moment. That game, I absolutely think they will pull off the shelf when they have in mind to quit with a group of friends, right? There are other games like, Mindlight actually is a good example that I think mental health professionals and schools will be more likely to get to kids than kids themselves saying, please, please buy me Mindlight, right? So I think it's both its potential. And here's the thing, I think that Silicon Valley will be interested as soon as the prevalence rates turn to what they call TAMs, total addressable market. That means how many dollars can I make out of this? And so when you say, this is the number of people who are stressed instead of anxious and depressed, and this is how you can impact them and make a better image for yourself, it's dollars. And I want to work with people who care about this enough that they can spin it that way. But I think we can do that, a good job that way as well. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
When you're designing games, are you actively like considering the game as just a game by itself, like something that anyone can play?
Yes, so the question is, when we design a game, are we actively thinking of it as a game just as a game itself without any necessarily added benefits or something? So here's the thing, I think that playing games and feeling joy and happiness and connectedness and you know, a close relationship with your parent when you play video games and so on is a good thing in and of itself, even without evidence-based mechanics, right? So I think, so there are lots of, we don't have to make those. There's lots of games out there already, and we have an American psychologist paper out in 2014 saying that there's a bunch of benefits, cognitive, social, emotional, motivational benefits of video games outside of any designed psychologist intervention for those things, and I think they have huge benefits. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
I'm thinking about, you know, the baby Einstein and all these sort of ridiculous things that make all sorts of claims that sound very similar to the sorts of claims that you're making, but you have evidence to support the claims you're making. And so what do you think about like the ways people who are doing the sort of work you're doing will differentiate the products that they're bringing to market from the products other people want to bring to market but sort of piggyback on or appropriate the language you're using or the effects you're...
Yeah, so it's a big problem and one I recognize is really important to address, and there's a couple of ways to address it that we've found. So the first is that I'm part of a consortium of scientists who, things like brain training, who have been doing cognitive training and tasks and so on for 2 decades and have been doing the rigorous science around it, and then Lumosity comes in with these incredibly ridiculous claims and gets sued. I think there's going to be a shift towards people asking about the evidence base because there's got to be something to differentiate you in this huge market. And so I think that there's 2,200 plus apps for depression out there. Not one, well, 0.001% have any evidence to back them up. There's science-based because you can do meditation, and meditation has been linked to, you know, decreases in depression. But in terms of actual evidence for any of these products, there's almost nothing. And I think eventually people are going to say, there is some kind of standard of evidence that we want, just like we have for all sorts of other things, right? So, but I think that scientists actually have to push for that and actually join the conversation. If we don't, then I think it'll keep going cuckoo. Yeah.
Silicon Valley, I guess, like, changed the way that they make money off games, but now it's leaning towards microtransactions as opposed to the idea of like buying the Xbox thing. It's like initial startup cost into your game, and now it's more like downloadable content, and like Fortnite is really notorious for this, and using a gambling system. So in looking to introduce these games like, to the promotional market, I suppose, how would you, I guess, like, would you incorporate that kind of microtransaction-based
No, I want to use it for good, not evil. So the question basically is that there's a very, very strong business model out there. Oh, it's actually also faltering for lots of reasons. People feel manipulated and so on. And it's not so new in that world anymore. But with microtransactions, that you buy little bits within a game, for example, or you buy a new axe or something in a game and so on, and that's how they've monetized these games instead of paying $60 for one huge game. And the question is, how do we think of using that? And I think there's some super cool ways of using it for good, not evil, right? So one of the things that drove me crazy about Clash of Clans thing, this game that's incredibly popular, is that you would get more points or get stronger or something very beneficial if you logged in every morning at a certain time or between a certain time, right? And then you get these bonus points. Now, wouldn't it be cool if you have a depression app that says, hey, connect to your 2 closest friends, you know, right now, because this is your period right before bed where you ruminate the most, right? So if we can think about the same mechanic, the same strategies that you know, people are using in marketing to make money, but instead for us, our currency is attention towards training something healthy, for example, we could be doing a great job. I think calling the whole thing negative and we'll never do it is actually losing a lot of opportunities, especially if you can co-op something that people are already doing in another context, and now you do it for good, so it feels like the same kind of thing, but now it has a benefit for people. Yeah.
So thanks, that was very interesting. I'm wondering particularly about the data you presented on mechanisms with the RCT you presented. Fascinating. You were presenting kind of the way I understand it, those are in video game mechanisms.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you have any data or anything on outside of video game mechanisms. And so here what I'm thinking is a transfer from skills learned or things that you're doing in the video game into things that people are reporting or that you're observing outside of the video game that are then tracking the reductions in symptoms.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's something that's absolutely necessary to show, is that it's not just improvement in the game, it's how does that have an impact on your real life. So the MindLight trial, just keep in mind that that's self-reported anxiety in context. So it's like what everybody uses in prevention context, like cognitive behavioral, to say, are you afraid of the dark? How afraid of the dark are you? Are you afraid of making new friends? And it's parent report. So there's some generalization to how are they doing in their school context, home context, and so on, that I think is important. And it's actually the same measures that all other psychologists. But on top of that, what we're doing with the deep study that I showed you, that I said we don't have data until 2 weeks from now, is we're also looking at physiology and regulation of physiology, not only after the game, but also in the Trier's social stress task, so in this kind of different kind of social stress, and does that generalize to physiology in general, and so on, that kind of thing. So I think it's really, really important. Yeah. Yeah.
So how are or how will these games be classified, like in stores or in the app store? Because like for people to play, they'll have to actively search a keyword or look for it in the store, which means they're recognizing that there is a problem. But you know, in certain parts of the world, that still might be stigmatized.
It's still stigmatized everywhere, except for LA. So yes, good question. So that's a huge host of questions. So the first answer is, I would love to work with social entrepreneurs who can think about marketing strategies in different ways that are innovative and interesting and so on. One way to pitch it is the health market, okay? The mental health market, the health market. We know that people go online looking for help for depression, anxiety, and so on, and what they get are websites that are stagnant and so on, and we can imagine ways of giving them where games are being brought up as answers to that sort of private searching that they do, right? The other thing is really interesting. We just finished 2 studies, and I'll just tell you about the one where we randomly assigned people who are already high in depressive symptoms to pick, sorry, we didn't randomly assign them. high in depressive symptoms, they watched 2 trailers. One was a trailer that was around mental health. It was the same game in the background that they were going to play. And they were told, which game do you want to play? One had a mental health message. This is going to help your depression. It has helped other people with depression. It's great for you. The other trailer said, this game won all the best awards. It's the most entertaining. It's gotten 100 out of 100 for the best game in the year, or whatever it is. And they were allowed to choose the game, and then we also observed how long they played it, so did they stay engaged in the game. And what was really interesting is people who were most at risk picked the mental health game and continued to play it as long as people who played the entertainment game, right? So even people who are actually having the issues would choose those games that are labeled as mental health, which to me is really encouraging. Part of the reason we did that study is like, how do we do this with Mindlight? Do we just say it's a fun game, but then nobody knows that it has benefits? Or is it stigmatizing to say that? And I think a lot of people who need the help may actually look for it, even if it's in the closed doors of their bedroom or something like that. But there might be different strategies as well. Yeah.
I have 2 questions. One is the youngest age you think could play deep, and the other is...
Did you see the 5-year-old? It's a lovely game.
And the other is about whether you noticed any differences between girls and boys.
Really good question. So there are differences in the types of, the genres of games that girls and boys play, not in the rate of games that they play, but the kinds of games. No surprise, the more narrative-based social games are girls and boys, but there's a lot of overlap. So Minecraft, there's no difference in genders. In terms of reacting to these games, 0 different. And I'm actually surprised because the avatar in Mindlight was a boy because we didn't have enough money to do 2. And he was kind of not exactly a boy, whatever. But girls liked it just as much. And we asked about that because we wondered about it. Ideally, what we would want is people to design, not design, but like to curate and make their own avatar so that they identify to some degree with it. Yeah, and there's some evidence that that's a good thing. Yeah.
Accessibility. So in a lot of the examples, there were used secondary text like developer that seemed like either hard to access or like expensive to obtain. So my question is when you're designing a game in general, how much do you weigh how effective a tool will be versus how hard it will be to get it to win friends?
It's a great question. So, I was initially going to talk about biofeedback games only, and that's why the ones I chose. The social games we're now designing have no outer thingy, and the whole reason they're social is so that we can reach more people and they're more excited about it, but also that the social processes and mechanisms are being targeted. But both are important. There's tons of people wearing wearables right now, tracking their steps and tracking their whatever. So there's going to be a market probably for both of those things, and there's something extremely powerful about biofeedback and physical entrainment and embodiment of the kinds of training that you're doing. So I don't want to let that go too quickly, especially because I think that very soon our devices are tracking all this anyway, and I suspect that most of this stuff is going to be embedded in our everyday lives in ways that become seamless. But in the near future, we're doing both. Yeah. Yeah.
So you kind of touched on it, but didn't go into a lot of detail. And I feel like knowledge translation is like constantly the perpetual problem.
Yeah.
This kind of research.
Yeah.
Most of our research. So I'm interested in what steps are you taking towards moving this forward to clinicians and to commercialization or parents, or so people know that this is something that they can do, or is this going to become something that people actually can act on?
Yeah. So it's a huge barrier. So we've got a few ways that we're attacking it. One way is to work directly with brands that already want to look good in the science, but have their own brand that they want to get out to people. So that's the Aardman animation people that we work with, for example, who are already doing movies and are already well known, and now they are working with us to make a game, and we're making sure that the science under the game is right. So that's one avenue. The other is to figure out how to get investor money that's real commercial money. And so ideally, I'm going to start an institute, and that institute is going to have 3 disciplines working together. One's going to be design, one's going to be behavioral science, and the other one's social entrepreneurship. And the students will be brought up in this kind of intersection and will learn all three domains so that they can pull that immediately as people are designing, they're also thinking about whose hands, how it's going to market, et cetera, as the science is being done as well. So that's like the ideal world. But right now, here and now, it's more about partnering with the right people who can get it out.
What gets in the way of moving it forward? Like, what are those barriers?
Money?
Yeah.
Well, money, so to be really clear, everybody says, well, why don't you give the game out for free? I'd be happy to do that, but somebody has to actually update the code, and it has to run on every computer, and then the computers change, and then you have to have a help desk, and et cetera, right? So the biggest is money from the right tranche. I'm a scientist, so I can get research funds, and I do, and it's great. We have all this research behind this product now that is absolutely ready to go. But you need money from another context, which is a commercial context that wants to do that other part. And we're trying. I mean, I can go, that's another glass of wine, to fit the partners that we're partnering up with. But yeah, that's the main thing.
Well, maybe that's a good segue.
That's a good segue.
Speaking of glass of wine, thank you to